August 2025, in an interview with Rolling Stone, director James Cameron, the man behind Titanic, Avatar, and the Terminator movies, speculated that the combination of AI and weapons systems could lead to a, quote, Terminator-style apocalypse, right here in the real world. Cameron named 3 existential threats: climate catastrophe, nuclear weapons, and superintelligence.
For listeners who aren't familiar with the Terminator narrative, or only associate it with a few memorable Schwarzenegger quotes, it's a story about a cyborg assassin sent back in time from 2029 to 1984 to kill a woman before she can bear a child who will, in an apocalyptic future, save humanity from a hostile artificial intelligence.
It's a story with clearly religious parallels, so it makes sense that the idea of apocalypse, which secular culture has inherited from the Christian tradition, would be involved. But films and stories featuring apocalypse don't always have religious parallels. You can call a story apocalyptic if it just has to do with the end of the world, or at least some major cataclysm.
But where do these ideas about the apocalypse come from? And why is apocalypse such a popular trope in the current collective imagination? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of Glad You Asked.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask but not so easy to answer.
Hi, Rebecca. How are you today?
I'm actually really excited to talk about the apocalypse.
Glad one of us is. I will admit, I've always been really into kind of dystopian novels and books, but lately, a lot of them have just been hitting a little too close to home for me.
Yeah, I can see that, although I am also the person who, as soon as COVID started, had to sit down and read any pandemic literature I could get my hands on. I may have mentioned before on the podcast, but I grew up kind of as a prepper, preparing for the end of the world, and my dad was obsessed with this idea, so we lived off grid and raised our own food, did things like make our own soap, which wasn't very good. We had a whole room full of dried gourds and corn and beans. My sister and I called these our apocalypse beans. So I'm kind of comfortable in a way right now. I'm looking around and I'm like, the world is bad, but I have more to eat than just apocalypse beans.
So, probably I'm not the only person in the world who has a plan for what they'll do when the zombie apocalypse happens, or, insert your own apocalyptic vision here. So for a long time, my vision involved going to the grocery store to stock up on food, but I wasn't just going to go to any grocery store. I was going to specifically go to an Asian market because they always have these giant bags of rice and beans and other bulk foods. And so I got the chance to test this out during COVID, the day that the governor shut down the state and everything closed all of a sudden. My husband called me on the phone and said, I'm going to stop at the grocery store before I head home because who knows when we're going to be able to go to the grocery store again. And I was like, go to the Asian market. And sure enough, he said he went to the normal grocery store and they were out of everything except wild rice. And at the Indian grocery store, he got like a giant bag of rice, giant bags of beans. We were all set. So I guess the moral of that story is the apocalypse is kind of happening. We have all kind of lived through mini apocalypse, maybe.
Yeah, and it seems like our history is filled with these kind of smaller or sometimes not so small apocalyptic events. And it seems our culture is, even though we tend to be very materialistic and very kind of like living in the moment, not thinking about tomorrow, we're also obsessed with the idea of apocalypse, even if not everyone is actively prepping for it.
Yeah, to go back to that Terminator story, I mean, first of all, I think the fact that we're still talking about Terminator, but so many of our most popular film and fiction deals with apocalyptic scenarios. Storytellers have always drawn on the idea of societal collapse to make their point about all kinds of things, whether it's robots or censorship, war, oppression.
And there's also the other side of it where there are people, often religious people, but not just religious people, who will take these prophecies about the end of the world very, very literally.
In this episode of the podcast, we'll be talking about the end of the world, or at least why so many people are obsessed with the idea of the world ending. I'm Emily Santa, one of the hosts of Glad You Asked.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day. What is the apocalypse?
To help us answer this question, we talked to author, scholar, and educator Ed Simon, author of the forthcoming book Writing During the Apocalypse. He's also the author of well over a dozen other books, including The Dove and the Dragon, A Cultural History of the Apocalypse, and Devil's Contract, The History of the Faustian Bargain.
Simon is a public humanities special faculty in the English department of Carnegie Mellon University and the editor-in-chief for Belt magazine and the forthcoming Pittsburgh Review of Books.
So hi, Ed. We're so glad that you could join us today on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.
There are so many things that you've written about that I would love to be able to talk to you about. But for the purposes of this podcast, I think Apocalypse will be interesting enough.
Sure.
So just to get us started, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about why we as humans are just so drawn to the apocalypse, from biblical narratives to now like current TV and books that are all post-apocalyptic. There's been kind of this enduring fascination with apocalyptic themes. Why is that?
It's, I think, a really important question. It kind of gets to the crux of what I wanted to explore in this book. And one of the things I think in The Dove and the Dragon, which is my book, that I think is important to emphasize, is that I'm not just or even primarily focusing on eschatology in a Christian sense. I mean, I talk a lot about it, right? I talk about Abrahamic apocalypticism, but I have a very kind of like expansive cultural definition of apocalypticism, which does incorporate lots of things that aren't necessarily Christian or Judeo-Christian or even religious in any conventional sense, that has to do with the destruction or the recreation of the world in some way. And so to that end, you'll see, as you mentioned, everything from, the ancient Norse belief in Ragnarok to current day post-apocalyptic narratives. And so I do think that there's something independent of any specific tradition that is kind of universal, or as close to universal. I mean, it's a very dangerous word to use in the humanities, obviously, but almost as close as I can imagine, that in some way, envisions or imagines what the end of the world might be like. And I think part of the reason for why that is such a perennial belief is it allows for individuals and communities to imagine a different way of the world being, right? It's a way of kind of taking stock of what the current status quo might be and envisioning an alternative to it. And that alternative could be something that involves violence and horror, or it could be something that is regenerative or redemptive in some kind of way. But I think it really comes out of our same facility that story making comes from. It's just that ability to imagine alternatives, but doing it on a kind of a grand cosmic scale.
So the word apocalypse literally means unveiling, and then kind of jump from that revelation. When and how did that come to mean the end of the world in popular imagination?
Yeah, that's a spectacular question, and one with a sort of surprising answer, because it's a relatively late development. As you said in the Greek original, apocalypse does simply mean unveiling, as in certain secret truths are revealed to somebody, right? In the literary genre of apocalypse, in ancient biblical and extra biblical writing, it's pretty much literally what it means. And frequently what was revealed, as in, the book of Revelation, John's book of Revelation, are intimations of what the end of the world would look like. But apocalypse becoming a synonym for that in the popular imagination really isn't until the 19th century that became really popular and widespread. And a lot of that is because of the influence of evangelical culture in the United States during the Second Great Awakening that hewed to what is called a premillennial dispensationalist model of eschatology. So basically, that's the belief that you have some sort of violent tribulation that precedes the arrival of Christ, right? And so that is frequently when you think of apocalypse in kind of American culture in particular, with all the kind of like accoutrement that's associated with it, from like the rapture to the, some of the specificity of the Antichrist and things. That comes specifically out of like a 19th century American Protestant understanding of things. But then the term becomes so secularized after that, right? I mean, apocalypse is used like Independence Day, the Alien movie is like a kind of apocalyptic movie or something, I guess, right? It doesn't have to be explicitly in a religious context. It kind of became divorced from that after that. It is an interesting question. I'd be curious to see how often the word, you see last days or end of days or all sorts of things in earlier tech. Obviously back centuries, but I think the word apocalypse to specifically mean the end of the world really comes into currency like 150 years ago.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting in your book was that you talked about how other ancient Near East traditions, like Zoroastrianism, really affected the development of apocalypticism in Israelite and then early Christian thought. Can you talk a little bit about how some of those traditions or beliefs were developed and were taken from other traditions?
Sure. I think that, Zoroastrianism is kind of like the secret sauce in Western monotheism, right? It's not an everyday word, and it's a vanishingly small community of people who still live in the world, though there are still Zoroastrians. Freddie Mercury of Queen was a Zoroastrian. That's your Zoroastrian fun fact of the day. But incredibly influential. One of those, cultural groups that had a profound influence that is entirely separate from their relatively small numbers today. And really the important thing I think Zoroastrianism introduced first to Judaism and then into Christianity after that is this idea of kind of an absolute good and an absolute evil. And so that Zoroastrianism, it's basically a duo-theistic religion. You have like a god of ultimate good and a god of ultimate evil, and they are relatively equivalent in their powers. And Ahura Mazda, who's the god of ultimate evil, is almost like a satanic figure, but he occupies an easier to understand space in Zoroastrian cosmology because he has equal power with the good god, unlike Satan in Christianity. But he kind of culturally occupies a role where he seems kind of like an anti-god who's almost equivalent, even though theologically we know that's not supposed to be the circumstance there. And so this kind of dividing of things in such a stark way between good and evil made a really strong impression on the Jews during the Babylonian, or in the years right after the Babylonian exile, because the Persians were those who were involved in their liberation from the Babylonians. And there's this kind of like cultural influence that comes into Judaism at that point, which is then preserved and carried on to the other, great Abrahamic faiths of Christianity and Islam. So, I think probably what Zoroastrianism really introduces is the idea of an ultimate absolute evil that kind of transmorgifies into some way of a satanic figure who's so central in apocalyptic thinking later on. There'd always been, malignant or malign spirits or whatever. That's a thing that's pretty commonly, seen across cultures and religions. But this type of like absolute figure, I think, is something Zoroastrianism introduces to Western thought.
In the apocalyptic literature of the Bible, and not just of the Bible, there's always this kind of, I guess you could say, trippy quality. It's kind of surreal, kind of Salvador Dali or Hieronymus Bosch.
Sure.
Is that an essential part of the literary genre, or is that something that's more specific?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I hadn't actually thought about much before. And I guess the short answer is I don't know. There are non-trippy apocalyptic texts, I guess, but there does seem to be something intrinsic about it, right? That brings this out. The thing with, and if you think of other things that are related, like the Book of Daniel, for example, is like, it's not quite as trippy as Revelation, but it's got some weird visions in it. But Revelation has always been kind of the odd book of the New Testament. I mean, no one has ever quite known what to do with it. In after the Reformation and Protestantism, certainly in the early modern period, if it was anything, was a kind of manifestation of apocalyptic fervor, and in a lot of ways, kind of took the fervor that had previously existed in populist movements in the medieval Catholic Church and kind of like put them into a different religious expression from the Catholic Church. But all of that being said, a lot of the reformers had like profound difficulties with Revelation. I mean, Luther kind of didn't want to include it in his German translation. And he was very much an apocalyptically minded figure. But I mean, there's this kind of irony in that, like the great advocate for sola scriptura wants to like take a scalpel to the Bible, right? It's the one book that Calvin did not write an exegesis of, and Calvin was in some ways less apocalyptically minded than Luther, but Calvinists certainly historically have been very apocalyptically minded. And there's a lot of, I don't know if consensus is fair to say, but there had been some belief that in the early church, the reason why Revelation made it into the final canon is because of the misnomer that it was written by the same John who wrote the gospel, which is most definitely not the case. And especially I think people who know a lot more about this than I do, if you're a philologist or something, you can like examine the language and see that they were not written during the same time period at all. But even as somebody reading it in English, I mean, the Book of John is this tremendously philosophical, erudite, literary kind of thing, and then Revelation is like a fever dream, right? I mean, you got it right. I mean, it's Salvador Dali-esque, and everything from you have multiple eyeballed sheep and the horror of Babylon and the dragon and all of these strange images that appear in it, which is what's so interesting about it as well, because people who are biblical literalists are often so drawn to Revelation, which is a book by definition you can't read in a literal way, right? Like it appears to be heavily allegorical, but whatever is being allegorized is difficult to say, especially, from a context so long after. So I do think that there's something about encoded mysteries or something that is esoteric, or it's a dangerous word to use, but almost occult, I think, is implicit in the form. Maybe it's implicit in the psychology of those who are drawn to the form, but it's something, it doesn't end with Revelation, certainly. I mean, you see it in medieval and early modern pamphlets, the same kind of strange spinning of visions, I guess.
Yeah, so the title of your book is The Dove and the Dragon, and these two ideas about the apocalypse show up throughout your book, right? Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the dove and the dragon and these two extreme views that people have of what the apocalypse is going to look like?
Yeah, so I think originally, my own academic background is in 17th century English literature and kind of the early American literature of the same time period. And so, from the 17th into the 18th and then into the 19th century in the American context, what type of apocalypse somebody believes in becomes very important. And so in the American context, we oftentimes distinguish between premillennial dispensationalism and post-millennial dispensationalism. And I know it's one of those, like, I always love how theology starts to sound like quantum mechanics at a certain point or something, right? But just to give kind of like a very brief summary. So, and I'd mentioned before, premillennial basically means that you have the apocalypse happens when it's going to happen, that you have this tribulation beforehand, and then the millennium, the 1,000-year period where Christ rules over the earth, happens after the kind of badness, right? Post-millennial dispensationalism imagines a millennium happening first and Christ coming at the end of it. And so there's how one interprets history, and then consequently how one understands current events or politics or what have you can be very different depending on which one of these things you embrace. So premillennial dispensationalism is apocalyptic. I mean, they're both technically apocalyptic, right? But I think it's apocalyptic in the popular sense of the word, right? that like you're going to have some sort of violent end to the world. Whereas post-millennial dispensationalism kind of believes that people working together can make a better and more perfect world, and that is what brings about the millennium, right? And interestingly enough, the Puritans in New England largely were post-millennial, and they had in some ways, despite the well-earned stereotypes about them today, kind of a progressive understanding of making a fairer, more just world, right? By the time of the Second Great Awakening, which happens in like the early 19th century, you have a shift to this kind of premillennial understanding that there's going to be some bad stuff that happens and that then Christ comes after that. So I divided these two. I basically, in my mind, said that premillennial dispensationalism is sort of like what we think of it popularly as apocalyptic. It's like the dragon, and that's the symbol that I used to represent it. Whereas post-millennial dispensationalism, which imagines a better and more perfect world happening, that's the dove, in my understanding. And I try to break this out of the confines of just talking about Protestantism or Christianity or Abrahamic religions, and to talk about it more generally. Because I think that you have, there's one way you can understand history where it's just kind of like one thing after another. But I do think there are certain models that either see things veering in a bad direction or naturally veering in a good direction, right? And these can be views that don't even appear traditionally as religious to us in some way, but they are at their core, right? So whenever, one of the examples I give later in the book is whenever somebody says, history will judge us for what we are doing or not doing or whatever. And that's oftentimes said by people who wouldn't consider themselves to be religious at all. They think it's a secular understanding, but it's de facto kind of theological, right? Because it has this idea that you have a history that we're naturally moving towards, that is inevitable in some way, that things will improve naturally. The arc of the history bends towards justice kind of thing, right? And that you can look back and see a certain narrative that is going to happen. And I think that that's a profoundly, in its origins, a profoundly religious way of seeing things. But I do think it's kind of like, in the same way that you can be a Beatles fan or a Stones fan, but you can't like equally like both of them. I think people who are predisposed to apocalyptic or teleological thinking, which is maybe all of us in the West to some extent, you kind of go towards the dove or the dragon. You kind of see a future goodness or a future badness as being kind of preordained in some way.
So this kind of really leads into our next question, which is how does this kind of apocalyptic imagining affect our current politics, especially things with modern Christian nationalism and applying biblical apocalypticism to current events?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if there's any important thing in the book, it has to do with interpreting contemporary culture and politics through this apocalyptic lens. And I think that, there's a tendency, especially among those, I don't know how many people still believe in the secularization hypothesis, but this idea that like religion just kind of disappears is demonstrably not true, right? I mean, religion just takes on different forms as is natural as would happen, right? And I think that apocalyptic thinking in specific has gone nowhere. It's mutated in different ways. So in the later chapters, I'll write about how Marxism is its own form of apocalyptic thinking in some ways, which Marxists don't like to hear, right? But like it follows a similar kind of like, instead of a tribulation, you have a revolution, and it's inevitable that this is going to happen, and you're going to have a better world on the other side of it, right? Fascism is its own form of apocalyptic thinking in a very different sort of way, but it still takes part in that same kind of schema. I think that it's not like liberal democracy is devoid of that sort of thinking. I mean, far to the opposite of that. And I do write a lot about how in the kind of in the 1980s resurgence of a certain type of evangelical Protestantism that then mutated into Christian nationalism and other assorted groups, like the new apostolic reformation, which I write about, or things like that. You have a very obvious kind of, premillennial dispensationalism that's like, if anyone's ever watched Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson or whatever, you kind of know what I'm talking about with that. But then I think it also comes in more kind of hidden sorts of ways as well. So one of the things I write about in terms of American politics is I read, the movement that helped elect Obama. How many years ago is that now? It's almost 20 years ago now. Like, Jesus. Not quite, but we're getting there. As being a manifestation of a particular type of post-millennial dispensationalism, right? This idea that we're building a better world, that the world, is veering towards justice and equality and so on. The language when Obama was elected, which seems so long ago now, but where people talked about how we were living in a post-racial society and so on, that had a millennial kind of feel to it in a lot of ways. And I think it reflects how a lot of American liberalism in its origins kind of comes out of that post-millennial dispensationalism. It's not a mistake that the abolitionists and the suffragettes and the temperance movements had their strongest base in New England. Like, that's not a contradiction at all from that being a Puritan kind of area, as opposed to the kind of like low church Presbyterianism, which proliferated in the frontier. And I think lent itself in the Second Great Awakening to that premillennial dispensationalism, that more pessimistic kind of traditionally apocalyptic understanding of things. And I read the movement behind Donald Trump as being in large part kind of a premillennial dispensationalist movement, right? This kind of like rhetoric of how everything is terrible and everything is awful, and violence in the streets, and was it American carnage and all of that sort of stuff. It has a very evangelical fervor to it. And sometimes that's literal. There's obviously a lot of evangelical support for Trump, but I think even among those who don't think of themselves as traditionally religious, maybe, although it's a complicated question, obviously, I think you have those kind of intimations of apocalypse that are in there. So in some ways, I argue that our current culture war is almost like a disagreement between competing understandings of the arc of history, I guess.
There's this scene in, I think it's the epilogue of your book. You talk about this photograph of masked doctors and healthcare workers looking out on a raging wildfire. And I think that image is a good example of how what we're experiencing today on a daily basis often feels very apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Is this unique to us and where we're living now, or have people always felt like they were kind of living at times that were reaching the end times?
That's a great question. I think the short answer, I don't think it's unique to us. Like, I don't think we're the only ones, but I don't think every generation necessarily feels that to the same degree. I think one of the things that I try to do with that sort of last chapter is talk a little bit about, when we demythologize things, there's also a danger of like ignoring legitimate, Like, just because the world hasn't ended yet doesn't mean that it won't. It's kind of the way I look at it. And, it's interesting because I have another book that's coming out in January. It's almost like a companion piece to this in some ways. And it's called Writing During the Apocalypse, Reflections on the Great Unraveling. And it's a very different kind of book. Because it doesn't, like the Zoroastrians don't make an appearance in this one, right? It's much more about what is it like to live during our current moment, as you just described, which feels so apocalyptic, between climate change and pandemic and rising authoritarianism and artificial intelligence and like the litany of things we doom scroll through every day, right? And I think, that book I was inspired to write in part because back when I was still on social media, I had tweeted something about how apocalyptic everything felt. And somebody was very much like, well, everyone thinks the world's going to end, but then the world never ends. And I think, well, everyone thinks that they're going to die, and then one day they're right. Right? Like, that was kind of my like feeling about it. And so, I guess what I wanted to end with that epilogue was the sort of, we have a model that is culturally and religiously and literarily kind of overdetermined, where we use the word apocalypse and we can apply it to things that are real and have material and tangible qualities to them. And they can help us to make sense of those particular things. So that like something like climate change might not literally be an apocalypse in the way that Revelation says, but it could literally be the collapse of civilization or something, right? That we don't, and that sort of language of apocalypse, I think, has an emotional and an analytical utility to it that I think is really helpful to use. But yeah, I think I didn't intend for this to happen in this way. It's interesting because the book that comes out later was, this book that you were talking about right now was written a couple years ago now. I mean, it's already kind of in the past, and I finished the subsequent book later on. But I think, kind of the way publishing schedules work together, they got grouped together on the calendar somehow. And I do think that they're kind of like partner pieces, or the second one's a companion piece in some way. Because the second one's like it's much more in the spirit of that epilogue. It's a much more personal book. And it is sort of like, how does one live in 2025 with the weight of everything that's happening around us and this accumulated 2,000 years of tradition, which kind of imagines a thing that we almost feel like we're experiencing right now, right? And I do think that there's a lot of similarity that we have to past moments where people have worried about things like that, whether it's the wars of religion or the Black Death or whatever. And I think that there's like past apocalyptic moments we can kind of look to and learn from in that regard.
So you've touched on this a little bit, but could you unpack a little bit more about how people who are leading these debates today, whether it's about climate change, about pandemics, technology, or, on the more conservative side, protecting the family or defending tradition, how these kind of tap into these apocalyptic fears?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you go through the litany. I think like the one thing that everyone has in common is like no one's optimistic, right? I mean, it's sort of like, what are you worried about? Is like the real question. I think that they both tap into, I mean, that sense of chaos, that sense of disarray, that sense of collapse in some way that is definitely apocalyptic. I also think that there are groups of people or ideologies that have a kind of post-millennial dovish understanding of a better future that is still apocalyptic as well, right? So one of the things I talk about in the book is a kind of esoteric movement called transhumanism, which is, if you've ever heard anyone who's said like, I'm going to download my brain into a computer and live forever in like a simulation or something. It's this very Silicon Valley kind of, or the belief that there's something that's going to happen called the singularity, which is supposed to be this moment when all computational power exceeds our ability to explain it. And like the basically computers apotheosize into some sort of like messiah figure. It's like robot Jesus basically, right? But it's folks who are like estimably in their mind hard-headed rationalists who don't fall in for like supernatural nonsense, right? Even though it is like far more supernatural than any kind of a mainline form of Christianity. I mean, I think a lot of that is in its own way a form of post-millennial dispensationalism, right? It's this idea that through technology and progress, like that humans can reach some sort of perfection, right? It's also an example, and it was one of the things, because, I mean, probably the way I just described it, I'm not a particular fan or don't take it that seriously, other than being worried by the fact that some very rich and powerful people do. And I think that that's worrying. But I didn't want the book, too, to come down to too much of me being like, the dragons are bad and the doves are good, right? Like, I didn't want that to be implicit. Like, I think a lot of damage can be made by people who are adherents of the dove as well, even if it's like more hopeful or more optimistic. I don't think it's quite as simple as a binary, right? And so I do think that at this particular point in time, different factions have their different apocalypses that they have kind of chosen. They're different eschatologies. They're different ways of understanding the current world. I mean, I guess a kind of Enlightenment era mainline centrist liberalism or something is like the least apocalyptic way of viewing things. And I don't know that there's many people like that left necessarily.
This is another one that you've kind of already touched on, but as we kind of wrap up our conversation, Would you say that the apocalypse is real in any meaningful sense, or is it and will it always be a story that we just tell ourselves about what happens at the end?
That's a great question. I think that collapse is definitely real. I mean, I think that there's like plenty of cultures and civilizations historically that have collapsed, and I am not sanguine about our chances right now, I guess. But I don't know that that is necessarily the same thing as apocalypse. I think apocalypse is sometimes a story that we say about collapse, right? I think one of the interesting things, it was Derrida wrote in his like kind of late turn, the French philosopher, his like late turn to religion, which is really interesting. He wrote an essay about apocalypse, and he said, by definition, if you say the word post-apocalyptic, that's a contradiction, right? Because if there's a post to the apocalypse, there's still people who are there to comment on it. So I think for me personally, with my own confused theological commitments, I guess, I've always found apocalypse to be most useful as an allegorical thing. It's an allegorical model for understanding things that keep on happening. And I think, but as an actual finality, an actual terminus, I think that's something I'm agnostic on, I think, the literalism of it.
So we always close these conversations by asking our guest, what's the one thing you would want people to take away from this conversation?
I think that what I really, one of the things I always joke about with writing is that I oftentimes don't know what I think about something till I've actually written about it. Like, I don't think I've read a book unless I've reviewed it. I don't. And so a lot of times my books, I discover what my argument is after I've actually like written the whole thing. So I think the argument that I discovered from The Dove and the Dragon is that I think apocalypse and all of the things that are associated with it, kind of the fundamental Western idea. I think that it is the most one of the most important structuring concepts of how humans understand history and our role within it across disparate cultures and traditions and religions and denominations and so on. And I think it's that apocalypse as a concept doesn't have to look like the Omen, right? It doesn't have to be the kind of stereotypical understanding of what people have it as, but that revolutionary thinking can be apocalyptic, or reformist thinking can be, I guess, millennial in its own way, right? But I think just that, apocalypse is almost more frequent of a concept, I think, than God is when it comes out of a religious context. I mean, there's lots of people, I think, who are atheists, but I think everyone kind of believes in apocalypse to varying degrees. Maybe what I got out of it.
Well, thanks so much, Ed. This is all the questions that we have. We really appreciate you talking to us today.
Thanks so much.
So I really enjoyed taking all of this time to devote to apocalypse in a more theoretical framing.
It is one of your issues, your recurring themes, Rebecca.
Yeah, apocalypse, that's my beat.
So, being the expert in apocalypse that you are, was there anything that surprised you in the course of this interview?
So yeah, I was a little surprised by the idea that apocalypse as a term that refers to the end of the world wasn't really used that way until the 19th century, because obviously apocalyptic literature is quite old, pre-Christian, and the apocalypse, the book of Revelation, inspired so much, literature and art in the Middle Ages. I just kind of made this connection in my head that apocalypse in people's minds had referred for quite a long time to the world ending.
I think this surprised me more than perhaps it should have. But one thing that really struck me was this idea that apocalypse is not just a religious concept, that you can talk about communism as being apocalyptic. Certainly technology and AI. I mean, we've written about that in US Catholic, right? That the rise of AI and weapon system can lead to an apocalyptic future. But I've always kind of thought about the term in reference to Revelation, to the prophets, to Ezekiel. And I think it was this kind of new idea to take a step back and put it in context, and explore how it had spread far beyond that.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by this idea of apocalypse being looked at in kind of the positive or the negative way. And it's interesting how much, at least in our culture, whatever phenomenon or new experience people are encountering, it seems like they have to fit it into some kind of a narrative about, well, where's this going next? Is this going to be good for us? Is it going to be bad for us? And it's always like the stakes are really high. It's not just, oh, well, over the next few centuries, this thing will shape society. It's more like this will be either end everything or fix everything. And I'm kind of intrigued by this way that we have of thinking and whether it's actually helpful.
Yeah, I thought his framing of the dove and the dragon that showed up in his book title was a more helpful way. I mean, I've heard like premillennialism, post-millennialism. I'm going to be honest, am never, those are never going to stick in my head, which is which, right? But I did think that maybe this was like a more constructive framing for where we find ourselves today and kind of understanding different approaches towards the end of the world. Yeah, so was there anything that you wish we could have asked for more information about?
Yeah, I'm interested in apocalyptic literature, like old apocalyptic literature outside the tradition of Judaism and Christianity. Like I know if you look at ancient Greek myth and ancient Norse myth, there are definitely these stories about, it's all going to come to an end. But I would love to take a little class on apocalyptic mythologies across the globe just to, have more apocalypse.
One of the things that I thought was super interesting about his book that we did not have time to get to was he traced kind of the development of apocalypse from Zoroastrianism, so the religion that is older than anything we have in our Bible, and he traced that up to kind of the development of the religious right and Christian nationalism, and pulled all these threads together through the Enlightenment, through modernity, through World War II, right? And it just, you see how these are all connected. And we don't have time to get into that in a 20-30 minute interview, but I would have loved to just been able to get him to tease some of that out, because that was just, you really kind of understand these worldviews and how they have endured despite kind of the changing world around them.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because obviously, like running around worrying about whether the apocalypse is coming is profoundly unhelpful unless it comes to like motivating you to, grow more beans. But it does seem like it's extremely helpful to think about our culture as a culture that is constantly retelling and recycling this version of history. And I wonder whether it's one of the reasons why we miss the fact that history kind of repeats patterns because we're constantly looking for the big apocalyptic event instead.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there was, I think he said this in the interview. It came up in his book too, where he says at some point that apocalypticism is more important than theology, is more important than anything else for understanding why our world is the way it is. And I read that and I was like, okay. But now, after reading all of his book, talking to him, I'm a little more convinced.
Yeah, something else I'd be interested in looking at is whether are we obsessed with the idea of apocalypse because we know that each one of us is going to die, and that's going to be pretty apocalyptic for each one of us, and we'd kind of like the rest of the universe to acknowledge that.
Yeah, there's an individual and a societal end to everything, right?
Right.
Which maybe brings us to our last question, which is, of course, if you were going to write a sermon that touched on the topics we talked about in this interview, what would the sermon be?
So my sermon would be to remind people of faith that the statements, the prophecies regarding the end of the world, the return of Jesus, and so forth, whether we're taking them from scripture or from private revelations, those all tend to be kind of vague and obscure. What's not vague and obscure are Jesus's commandments about how we are supposed to live to bring about God's kingdom right here on earth. And if more of us took those seriously instead of looking at these arcane statements and trying to decipher them, perhaps we would be living the gospel a little more effectively.
Yeah, I keep coming back to something he said, which was the apocalypse will happen and that it will end. There is an end to humanity at some point. We don't know what it is. We don't know when it will come, but nothing lasts forever. Humanity is not going to last millions and millions and millions of years, right? So we can't control or know what the future of humanity looks like, but all we can control is our actions and how we act in the meantime. So while it is tempting in some ways to examine Revelation and interpret and try to figure out who's the Antichrist and who are the horsemen and, go deep into the weeds there, that takes us away from what we could be doing to create a better world for the people who are currently living in it.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Are you a fan of apocalyptic literature? Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to share a special offer for Glad You Asked listeners. Glad You Asked podcast is a project of U.S. Catholic Magazine, which is published by the USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries. This season, we're offering listeners 25% off a print or digital subscription to U.S. Catholic. Subscribe now and see why the Catholic Media Association recently named us the best Catholic general interest magazine for the 4th year in a row. To claim this special offer, visit uscatholic.org/GYA subscribe.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Santa, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.